listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Washington Post reports Israel says border secured, army to go on the offensive. Israel's military announced that the country's border is under control after hours of fighting and airstrikes today. Brigadier General Dan Goldfuss of the 98th Division said the military is now moving into the offensive to change the reality within Gaza to prevent such a thing from happening again. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So President Biden was set to address the United States today, earlier, as the U.S. rushes to deliver military aid to Israel. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, I think it's important for your audience domestically and globally to recognize that this is a very tricky and fraught moment. Let me refer you to recent stories in the New York Times. Yesterday, for example, one of their columnists suggested that as a result of this recent conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, that it bespeaks the onset of a new world order, believe it or not. And I understand why that columnist came to that conclusion. And yet, today in the New York Times, the once and perhaps future Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, second in line to the presidency, speaking of Kevin McCarthy, said that there was a new axis of evil, speaking of Iran, Russia, and China. Given the fact that the U.S. authorities have moved a naval flotilla closer to the area of conflict, and given the drumbeat of propaganda suggesting that Iran is actually the hidden hand behind Hamas, as reflected in the story in the Wall Street Journal just the other day, and given the fact that this escapade in Ukraine by U.S. and NATO is not going very well, to put it mildly, there is a possibility that U.S. imperialism will act upon its age-old nostrum of not allowing a crisis to go to waste, and reflecting a further nostrum by the late Pentagon chief Donald Rumsfeld, that is to say that if you have a problem, the way you deal with it is to enlarge it. There is, I'm afraid to say, a distinct possibility that we may, and I underline may, be on the cusp of a wider conflict that could easily tip in to, hold your breath, World War III. Now, let me mention some other contrasting and conflicting stories that should be sobering and perhaps reassuring. Recall that in the last 24 hours, Mr. Biden was able to knock together a coalition involving Britain, Germany, France, Italy, the usual suspects, in support of Israel. But my question in looking at that statement was, where was Japan and where was South Korea? Were they asked? If they were not asked, that exhibits a fault line in the emerging coalition that seeks to reassert U.S. hegemony. Recall the discussions about opening a North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Northeast Asia. And if they were asked and they refused, well, that raises even more troubling questions about the prospects and future of a U.S.-dominated planet. And keep in mind as well what is happening around the globe. The Saudis issued a statement with regard to this conflict that was wholly supportive, believe it or not, of the Palestinians. And keep in mind that there are those who have been suggesting that one of the reasons why you can point the finger at Iran in terms of this conflict is because Iran wanted to flummox this emerging accord between the Saudis and Israel. I think that's a bit far-fetched, particularly when one considers the fact that, as to be expected, You have predominantly Islamic nations, speaking of Pakistan, Indonesia, the giant of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Malaysia, their comrade in arms in terms of the Islamic Muslim bloc. Not to mention the Turks, whose flaps with the Israelis over the decade have become notorious. And of course, the Turks are quite close to Hamas. This may suggest that the Japanese, the South Koreans may be hedging their bets in light of this kind of coalition that is emerging in the Arab and Muslim world. And also, I should issue a warning, at least a note of caution to our progressive friends here in North America. I think that one of the reasons we've had so much leeway in terms of fighting back against this escapade in Ukraine is because of the balance of forces. We all know that there is a bloc in Congress that is hotly opposed to more funding to the Zelensky regime in Kiev. But this conflict in Israel-Palestine is a different kettle of fish. And there is much more unity amongst the duopoly, amongst the two leading parties, and amongst the U.S. ruling class as a whole, which does not necessarily bode as favorably with regard to opposition to this current conflict. I'm thinking of the recent words of the Harvard Law School professor emeritus, Alan Dershowitz, who called for a crackdown on campuses. Already you see this reflected in the New York Post, the voice of Rupert Murdoch, the Australian-American billionaire, which has highlighted the protests in favor of the Palestinians, particularly at California campuses. And keep in mind as well, the rather vitriolic attack on Congresswoman Omar of Minnesota, not to mention Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of the Squad of Michigan. This is quite sobering. And if you let your minds reel back, recall that a turning point for progressive forces here in North America was the war on the Korean Peninsula in 1950 to 1953. That facilitated a stunning crackdown on the left. It led to the continuing and the escalation of marginalizing of Paul Robeson and those of his ilk, something we have yet to recover from. And if we're not careful, that particular episode could be replicated. And recall that when in 1957, the U.S. Supreme Court finally decided that it was time to engage in a ceasefire against the organized left, their premise in the infamous Yates case was that if it seemed as if the organized left was gaining influence, well, all bets were off. You could throw the First Amendment out of the window and you can engage in a further crackdown. So this is what we should keep in mind as we go forward. And I trust and I hope that this will be in the forefront of the thinking of our friends in the progressive movement.
Orinoco Tribune reports that there was an interview with Sani Adumu. He is the Secretary General of Niger's Revolutionary Organization for Democracy, and he talked about the root causes of the recent coups. And basically, he said what is happening can be attributed to the, quote, exhaustion of the neo-colonial model. Your thoughts?
Well, this speaker, this commentator, has reflected some of the points that I was trying to make. In terms of talking about the exhaustion of the neo-colonial model, he could just as well have articulated the fact that we may be on the cusp of a new world order. And when we are on the cusp of a new world order, that suggests that the old powers cannot rule in the old way, and that the masses, not least in Africa, refuse to be ruled in the old way. And then the question becomes, is there a force that can take advantage of this confluence of forces? Because of the repression of the civilian left, the assassination of those like Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, the default position now in terms of leading this struggle against neocolonialism in Africa has devolved to certain progressive forces in the military. And recall that historically, this is nothing new. If you think about the overthrow of fascism in Portugal in 1974, this was at the hands of the armed forces movement in Lisbon, which then managed to pull Portugal out of the losing colonial wars in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. So we all know that the idea of progressive military is hardly a new phenomenon. It's hardly unknown. And I should also say that with regard to Niger in particular, pay careful and close attention to the fact that Washington finally has ruled that what took place in Niamey at the end of July 2023 was, in fact, in their words, a coup, unquote, which now allows Washington to follow the law, believe it or not, and crack down further on this regime that is obviously hostile to French neocolonialism. But given the fact that Washington is fighting brush fires in historic Palestine and Ukraine with Taiwan just around the corner, it's unclear to me, at least, if they will be able to mount an effective fight back in the Sahel region of Africa.
Two things quickly. One, you mentioned Donald Rumsfeld and his saying the way you deal with a problem is make it bigger. So with the United States sending this flotilla into the region, it seems as though since they could not bait Russia into escalating the Ukraine conflict, they haven't been able to get China to fight over Taiwan, that they're now using this conflict as the hopefully next escalatory adventure to get into a larger conflict. And then if you could just comment on that. And then I'm reading reports from places like the Indian Express that say Hamas may have hit or killed a brewing Israel-Saudi agreement. Here's how. And Fortune magazine is saying the same thing.
Well, with regard to the latter point, that's something that I alluded to a moment or two ago. And I think that given the statement that the Saudis made on this conflict, which was denounced by Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, that might have thrown a monkey wrench into this alleged emerging pact between Israel and the Saudis. It's not only historic Palestine that we have to keep an eye on with regard to trying to widen the conflicts and make a bigger problem per Donald Rumsfeld. I trust and I hope that you will keep a close eye on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Washington was able to bait the Armenians into taking a position that was interpreted widely as being critical of Moscow, and then that led to the fleeing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, which, of course, had theretofore been seen by many as an Armenian enclave on Azerbaijan territory. And then there are the recent reports coming out of Georgia, not the U.S. southern state, but the former Soviet republic, about U.S. operatives supposedly fingered in terms of trying to execute yet another so-called color revolution, because the regime in Tbilisi, once again, is seen as being all too close to Moscow. So we have our hands full in this country. And I trust and I hope that we'll be up to the task at hand.
And Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.